As a retirement planner with 37 years of experience, I've seen it all. Market crashes that wiped out portfolios overnight, pension funds that vanished like morning mist, and investment schemes so elaborate they made Ponzi look like a street corner hustler. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what I discovered about certain insurance plans that are systematically destroying the retirement dreams of millions of seniors across America. What I'm about to tell you will shock you to your core, and if you're approaching retirement or already retired, it might just save your financial life. For nearly 4 decades, I've guided thousands of families through the treacherous waters of retirement planning. I've held licenses in insurance, securities, and financial planning since the Reagan administration. I've weathered the Black Monday crash of 1987, the dot-com bubble burst, the 2008 financial crisis, and countless other market upheavals that would have sent lesser advisors running for cover. I thought I had seen every trick, every scheme, every way the financial services industry could separate seniors from their hard-earned money. I was wrong. Dead wrong. The revelation came on a Tuesday morning in October, 3 months ago. I remember it vividly because it was the day that changed everything I thought I knew about retirement security. Mrs. Eleanor Whitman, an 82-year-old former librarian with a gentle smile and sharp mind, sat across from my desk with tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. In her trembling hands, she held a thick manila folder containing what would become the most disturbing financial documents I'd ever examined. "Mrs. Chen," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the hum of my office air conditioning, "I think I've made a terrible mistake. My grandson said I should come see you because I might lose everything." Eleanor had been widowed 5 years earlier when her husband Thomas passed from complications related to diabetes. Thomas had been a machinist at the local Boeing plant for 43 years, and together they had saved diligently for retirement. They weren't wealthy by any means, but they had accumulated $340,000 in various retirement accounts, owned their modest 3-bedroom home outright, and had roughly $85,000 in savings accounts and CDS. By most measures, Eleanor was in decent financial shape for her golden years. But that Tuesday morning, as I began examining the documents she'd brought, I felt a familiar chill run down my spine. It was the same feeling I'd experienced in 2008 when I first started seeing the toxic mortgage-backed securities that would eventually bring down the global economy. Something was very, very wrong. The paperwork Eleanor had brought detailed an insurance product she'd purchased 18 months earlier, just 6 months after Thomas's death. It was marketed as a premium retirement security annuity with long-term care benefits, a mouthful of financial jargon that sounded impressive and reassuring to a grieving widow trying to protect her future. The sales material was glossy and professional, filled with charts showing guaranteed growth, testimonials from satisfied customers, and authoritative-looking statistics about the rising costs of healthcare and long-term care. What I discovered as I dug deeper into Eleanor's situation would keep me awake for weeks and ultimately lead to the most important investigation of my career. This wasn't just about one confused senior making a bad financial decision. This was about a systematic, industry-wide predatory practice targeting the most vulnerable members of our society, recent widows and widowers in their golden years. The insurance product Eleanor had purchased was structured as a hybrid annuity long-term care policy. On the surface, it seemed like a reasonable solution to 2 major retirement concerns: ensuring a steady income stream and protecting against the catastrophic costs of long-term care. The sales presentation had been compelling, delivered by a smooth-talking insurance agent named Derek Morrison, who had contacted Eleanor just weeks after Thomas's obituary appeared in the local newspaper. Yes, you read that correctly. Derek Morrison, like thousands of other insurance agents across the country, systematically scoured obituaries looking for recently widowed seniors. It's a practice so common in the industry that it has its own nickname, death stalking. These agents specifically target people in their most vulnerable emotional state, when grief clouds judgment and the fear of facing an uncertain future alone makes even bad financial decisions seem reasonable. Derek had presented himself as a specialist in widow protection planning, a term that should have raised red flags, but instead provided comfort to a woman struggling to make sense of finances her husband had largely handled. He painted a terrifying picture of Eleanor's future: healthcare costs that would destroy her savings, the possibility of becoming a burden on her children, the nightmare scenario of ending up in a substandard nursing home because she couldn't afford quality care. Then he presented his solution: the Premium Retirement Security Annuity. For the modest sum of $275,000, most of Eleanor's retirement savings, she would receive guaranteed income for life, plus long-term care benefits that could pay up to $6,000 per month for nursing home care if needed. The presentation material showed impressive growth projections and highlighted the safety and security of insurance products versus the risky volatility of traditional investments. What Derek didn't clearly explain, and what the fine print buried in complex actuarial language, was the reality of what Eleanor had actually purchased. As I worked through the numbers with a growing sense of horror, the true nature of this financial predator became clear. First, let's talk about the fees. Eleanor's $275,000 investment was immediately reduced by a 7.5% sales commission, meaning $20,625 went directly into Derek's pocket on the day she signed the contract. But that was just the beginning. The policy also included a 2.3% annual management fee, a 1.8% annual insurance cost, and a 0.9% annual administrative fee. Combined, these fees would consume nearly 5% of her investment every single year, $13,750 annually, or more than $275,000 over the 20-year minimum commitment period. To put this in perspective, Eleanor would have to earn more than 5% annually just to break even after fees, before accounting for inflation. Given that the policy's underlying investments were primarily in conservative bonds and money market funds yielding around 3% at the time, Eleanor was virtually guaranteed to lose purchasing power every year for the rest of her life. But the fee structure was only the first layer of this financial nightmare. The real devastation lay in the surrender charges and liquidity restrictions that effectively trapped Eleanor's money for 2 decades. If she needed to access her principal for any reason during the first 10 years, she would face surrender charges starting at 15% in year 1 and declining by only 1% per year. Even in year 10, she would still lose 5% of any withdrawal beyond the meager 10% annual allowance. This meant that if Eleanor faced a medical emergency, needed major home repairs, or simply wanted to help a grandchild with college expenses, she would be financially hamstrung. The very money she had accumulated to provide security and flexibility in retirement had been transformed into an inflexible financial prison. The long-term care benefits that had been presented as the policy's crown jewel were equally illusory. While the marketing materials prominently featured the $6,000 monthly benefit, the fine print revealed that this maximum would only be paid for qualified long-term care expenses, as defined by the insurance company, and only after a 90-day elimination period during which Eleanor would receive no benefits at all. Moreover, the benefit would be reduced dollar for dollar by any other insurance payments she might receive, and the total lifetime benefit was capped at just $200,000, barely enough to cover 2 to 3 years in a quality assisted living facility. Perhaps most insidiously, the policy's death benefit provisions meant that if Eleanor passed away without using the long-term care benefits, her heirs would receive significantly less than her original investment after accounting for fees and expenses. The insurance company had essentially created a heads-I-win, tails-you-lose scenario, where they profited regardless of what happened to Eleanor. As I explained these harsh realities to Eleanor that Tuesday morning, I watched the color drain from her face. The woman who had spent her career helping others navigate the complexities of literature and learning was confronting the devastating reality that she had been systematically deceived and financially manipulated during one of the most vulnerable periods of her life. "But he seemed so knowledgeable," she whispered, clutching the policy documents. "He had all these statistics about healthcare costs, and he said this was specifically designed for people in my situation. He said it was like having Thomas still there to protect me." That last comment hit me like a punch to the gut. Derek Morrison hadn't just sold Eleanor a bad financial product. He had exploited her grief, her fear, and her love for her deceased husband to manipulate her into making a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. It was financial elder abuse disguised as professional advice, and it made me angrier than I'd been in years. I spent the rest of that day researching Eleanor's insurance company and the specific product she'd purchased. What I discovered was even more disturbing than I'd anticipated. The Premium Retirement Security Annuity wasn't some obscure product sold by a fly-by-night operation. It was offered by National Prosperity Insurance, a well-known company with billions in assets and a marketing budget that dwarfed most small countries' GDP. More troubling still, this product was just one of dozens of similar hybrid annuity long-term care policies being aggressively marketed to seniors across the nation. The insurance industry had identified the perfect storm of demographic trends, regulatory gaps, and consumer fears that made these products incredibly profitable for insurers, while being potentially devastating for purchasers. The demographics were undeniable. The baby boomer generation was entering retirement in unprecedented numbers, with roughly 10,000 Americans turning 65 every single day. This massive cohort had accumulated more retirement wealth than any generation in history, but they were also facing longer lifespans, higher health care costs, and greater uncertainty about Social Security and Medicare benefits than previous retirees. Simultaneously, the regulatory environment had created a perfect cover for predatory sales practices. Unlike traditional investment products, which are heavily regulated by the SEC and FINRA, insurance products fall under state insurance regulation, which varies widely and is often less stringent. This regulatory patchwork allows insurance companies to market complex products with confusing terms and buried fees, while facing minimal oversight of their sales practices. The consumer psychology component was perhaps the most cynical aspect of the entire scheme. Insurance companies had conducted extensive research showing that seniors were most susceptible to financial manipulation during major life events transitions, particularly the death of a spouse. The combination of grief, fear, and unfamiliarity with financial management created the perfect conditions for high-pressure sales tactics and emotional manipulation. Derek Morrison's approach with Eleanor was textbook predatory sales technique. He had contacted her during her most vulnerable period, presented himself as an expert specifically qualified to help people in her situation, painted a terrifying picture of potential futures, and then offered his product as the only viable solution. He used time pressure. This special rate is only available through the end of the month. Social proof. I've helped hundreds of widows in your exact situation. And false authority, as a certified senior specialist, to overcome her natural hesitation. Most insidiously, Derek had positioned his product as the conservative, safe choice compared to the risky stock market investments Eleanor's previous advisor had recommended. This is a common tactic that exploits seniors' natural tendency toward risk aversion by presenting insurance products as guaranteed and secure, while portraying traditional investments as dangerous gambles. The reality, of course, is exactly the opposite. A diversified portfolio of low-cost index funds would have provided Eleanor with far more flexibility, lower fees, and better long-term growth potential, while still maintaining an appropriate level of safety for her age. As I dug deeper into National Prosperity Insurance and their sales practices, I began to uncover a web of aggressive marketing tactics that would have impressed the most ruthless boiler room operation. The company maintained a database of recent obituaries from newspapers across the country, cross-referenced with public records to identify high-net-worth widows and widowers. They then deployed a small army of agents armed with compelling sales presentations, emotional manipulation techniques, and financial products designed to maximize company profits rather than customer outcomes. The agents themselves were incentivized through commission structures that rewarded volume over suitability. Derek Morrison, for example, earned not only the initial 7.5% commission on Eleanor's policy, but also ongoing trail commissions for as long as she maintained the product. For selling Eleanor's policy, he earned more than $20,000 up front, plus roughly $2,000 annually for the next 20 years, assuming Eleanor lived that long and maintained the policy. These commission structures created obvious conflicts of interest that put agents' financial interests directly at odds with their clients' well-being. The more money an agent could convince a senior to put into these products, and the longer they could keep it there, the more the agent earned. There was no incentive to recommend more suitable alternatives or to consider whether the product was appropriate for the client's specific situation. I spent weeks researching the scope of this problem, reaching out to colleagues across the country, and examining regulatory filings and consumer complaints. What I discovered was a systematic pattern of predatory sales targeting seniors that spanned virtually every state and involved dozens of major insurance companies. The products varied in their specific terms and conditions, but they shared common characteristics: high fees, limited liquidity, complex terms that obscured their true costs and risks, and aggressive marketing targeting vulnerable seniors during major life transitions. The scale of the problem was staggering. Based on industry data and regulatory filings, I estimated that seniors were purchasing more than $50 billion annually in these hybrid annuity long-term care products. With average fees of 4 to 6% annually, the insurance industry was extracting roughly $3 billion per year from senior citizens' retirement savings through these products alone. But the financial cost was only part of the human tragedy. As I began connecting with other financial advisors and elder law attorneys, I heard story after story of seniors who had fallen victim to these predatory practices. There was Robert Martinez, a retired teacher who had invested his entire 403(b) rollover into a similar product, only to discover he couldn't access his money when his wife needed expensive cancer treatments. There was Dorothy Kim, a widow who had been convinced to put her late husband's life insurance proceeds into an annuity with such restrictive terms that she was essentially living in poverty despite having hundreds of thousands of dollars in investments. Each story followed a similar pattern: a recently widowed or divorced senior, often dealing with health issues or family stress, contacted by a smooth-talking insurance agent who positioned himself as a specialist in their specific situation. The agent would present compelling marketing materials, exploit the senior's fears about healthcare costs and market volatility, and pressure them to make an immediate decision before they could consult with family members or other advisors. The emotional manipulation was often breathtakingly cynical. Agents routinely use phrases like, "This is what your husband would have wanted," or "You need to protect yourself the way he protected you," to exploit grieving widows' emotions. They presented their products as conservative and safe, while portraying traditional retirement investments as dangerous gambles that could leave seniors destitute. They used artificial time pressure and fake scarcity to prevent seniors from taking time to properly evaluate their options. Perhaps most disturbing was the systematic way these companies targeted seniors during their most vulnerable moments. The obituary mining was just one tactic. Insurance companies also purchased lists of seniors who had recently been hospitalized, divorced, or experienced other major life events. They sponsored educational seminars at senior centers and retirement communities, often featuring free meals and presentations by actors posing as financial experts. They developed referral programs that paid bonuses to agents who could identify and recruit recently widowed friends and neighbors. The regulatory response to these practices had been woefully inadequate. While some states had implemented basic suitability requirements for annuity sales, enforcement was sporadic, and penalties were often too small to deter bad behavior. The complex nature of these products made it difficult for even sophisticated regulators to identify problematic sales practices, and the insurance industry's powerful lobbying machine had successfully fought off most attempts at meaningful reform. Meanwhile, the human cost continued to mount. Eleanor Whitman was just one of thousands of seniors who found themselves trapped in inappropriate financial products during what should have been the most secure period of their lives. Many were too embarrassed to seek help, believing they had made foolish decisions, rather than recognizing they had been systematically victimized by predatory sales practices. Eleanor's situation was particularly heartbreaking because she was actually relatively sophisticated about finances. She had spent years helping Thomas manage their investments and had a good understanding of basic financial concepts. But Derek Morrison had specifically exploited her grief and her unfamiliarity with insurance products to manipulate her into making a decision she would never have considered under normal circumstances. After my initial meeting with Eleanor, I knew I had to do something beyond just helping her with her individual situation. The scale and systematic nature of this problem demanded a broader response. I began documenting every case I encountered, building a database of predatory sales practices and their impact on seniors' financial security. I also started reaching out to regulatory agencies, consumer advocacy groups, and media outlets to raise awareness about these practices. The response was often frustrating. Regulators cited jurisdictional limitations and resource constraints. Consumer groups acknowledged the problem, but lacked the expertise to effectively combat sophisticated financial predators. Media outlets were often more interested in sensational stories than the complex, systemic issues that were actually driving the problem. But I persisted, driven by the memory of Eleanor's tears and the knowledge that thousands of other seniors were facing similar financial devastation. I began writing detailed complaints to state insurance commissioners, documenting specific instances of misleading sales practices and inappropriate product recommendations. I testified at legislative hearings about the need for stronger consumer protections. I collaborated with academic researchers to quantify the scope and impact of predatory annuity sales. Slowly, progress began to emerge. Several state insurance departments launched investigations into National Prosperity Insurance and similar companies. Consumer advocacy groups began including annuity abuse in their elder financial abuse prevention programs. A few media outlets started covering the issue, though often focusing on individual horror stories rather than the systemic problems that enabled them. The breakthrough came when I was contacted by Sarah Mitchell, an investigative journalist with the Wall Street Journal who had been tracking complaints about insurance companies targeting seniors. Sarah had uncovered internal company documents showing that National Prosperity Insurance had specifically developed marketing strategies to target emotionally vulnerable seniors, and had trained agents in psychological manipulation techniques designed to overcome consumer resistance. The documents revealed the cynical calculation behind these products. Company executives knew that most seniors would never fully utilize the long-term care benefits that were used to justify the product's high costs. They knew that surrender charges and liquidity restrictions would trap customers in inappropriate products. They knew that the combination of fees and conservative underlying investments would erode purchasing power over time. But they also knew that confused and frightened seniors could be convinced to purchase these products through aggressive sales tactics and emotional manipulation. The most damning document was an internal training presentation titled Maximizing Wallet Share from Grief-Impaired Prospects. The presentation provided detailed instructions on identifying recently widowed seniors, exploiting their emotional vulnerability, and overcoming common objections through fear-based selling techniques. One slide specifically instructed agents to position market volatility as an existential threat, and to emphasize the deceased spouse's desire for security and protection. When Sarah's article was published, it created a firestorm of controversy that finally brought national attention to the systematic abuse of seniors through predatory insurance sales. The article detailed Eleanor's story, along with similar cases from across the country, and exposed the internal company documents that revealed the deliberate and systematic nature of these practices. The response was swift and significant. Within days of the article's publication, attorneys general from multiple states announced investigations into National Prosperity Insurance and other companies engaged in similar practices. Congressional representatives called for federal hearings on predatory insurance sales to seniors. Consumer advocacy groups organized protests at insurance company headquarters. Most importantly, thousands of seniors who had been victimized by similar schemes came forward with their own stories. The flood of complaints revealed that the problem was even more widespread than I had initially estimated, with victims in every state and involving dozens of major insurance companies. Eleanor herself became an unlikely advocate for reform, agreeing to testify at legislative hearings and speak with media outlets about her experience. Her dignity and articulate description of how she had been manipulated helped put a human face on what might otherwise have remained an abstract policy issue. "I'm not a stupid woman," she told a legislative committee examining the issue. "I have a master's degree in library science, and I managed my family's finances for decades. But when you're grieving and scared, and someone who seems knowledgeable tells you that you're making a mistake that could cost you everything, you listen. These companies specifically target people when they're most vulnerable, and that's not just wrong, it's evil." The legislative response was encouraging but incomplete. Several states strengthened their suitability requirements for annuity sales and increased penalties for misleading marketing practices. A few states implemented cooling-off periods that gave seniors time to reconsider major financial decisions. Some jurisdictions required clearer disclosure of fees and surrender charges. But the insurance industry's political influence remained formidable, and many of the most significant reforms were watered down or blocked entirely. The industry argued that these products served a legitimate need and that increased regulation would reduce seniors' access to important financial tools. They pointed to satisfied customers and emphasized the complexity of retirement planning as justification for their current practices. The industry's defense was both technically accurate and deeply misleading. Yes, some customers were satisfied with their hybrid annuity long-term care products, but these were typically people who had purchased appropriate amounts of coverage at reasonable prices after careful consideration of alternatives. The problem wasn't with the products themselves, but with the systematic abuse of vulnerable seniors through predatory sales practices. The complexity argument was particularly cynical, as it was precisely this complexity that enabled predatory behavior. Insurance companies had deliberately created products so complicated that even sophisticated consumers struggled to understand their true costs and risks. They then used this complexity as cover for sales practices that took advantage of seniors' confusion and fear. Despite the regulatory limitations, the increased attention to these issues did create meaningful change. Media coverage made seniors and their families more aware of potential red flags in insurance sales. Financial advisors became more vigilant about identifying clients who might have been victimized by predatory practices. Some insurance companies voluntarily improved their sales practices and product designs in response to public pressure. Perhaps most importantly, the controversy sparked a broader conversation about the need to protect seniors from financial exploitation. Elder financial abuse had long been recognized as a serious problem, but it had typically been viewed as a criminal justice issue involving obvious scams and theft. The insurance industry situation revealed how sophisticated financial predators could operate within the legal system, using complex products and psychological manipulation to achieve the same devastating results as traditional financial crimes. For Eleanor, the outcome was bittersweet. The publicity surrounding her case and the regulatory pressure on National Prosperity Insurance eventually led the company to offer her a settlement that allowed her to exit the annuity with reduced surrender charges. She recovered roughly 80% of her original investment, a significant loss, but better than the complete financial devastation she had initially faced. More importantly, Eleanor used her experience to help other seniors avoid similar traps. She began volunteering with local senior centers, sharing her story and educating others about the warning signs of predatory financial sales. Her presentations were powerful and effective because she spoke from experience and could relate to the fears and concerns that made seniors vulnerable to these schemes. "The most important thing I learned," Eleanor would tell her audiences, "is that legitimate financial advisors don't pressure you to make immediate decisions, and they don't contact you right after major life events. If someone calls you after reading your spouse's obituary and says they have the perfect solution to all your financial worries, hang up the phone and call someone you trust." Eleanor's transformation from victim to advocate was inspiring, but it couldn't erase the fundamental injustice of what had happened to her and thousands of other seniors. The financial services industry had identified a vulnerable population and had systematically developed products and sales techniques designed to exploit their fears and confusion for profit. Even with increased awareness and modest regulatory reforms, the basic incentive structures and power imbalances that enabled these practices remained largely unchanged. The experience with Eleanor and the broader investigation into predatory insurance sales fundamentally changed my perspective on retirement planning and the financial services industry. For decades, I had focused primarily on investment strategies, tax optimization, and estate planning, the technical aspects of helping people prepare for retirement. While I had always been aware of unsuitable product sales and commission-driven conflicts of interest, I had viewed these as unfortunate side effects of an otherwise functional system. The systematic targeting of vulnerable seniors revealed something far more troubling: an industry that had weaponized complexity and emotional manipulation to extract wealth from the people it claimed to serve. The problem wasn't just a few bad actors or inappropriate products. It was a fundamental misalignment between the industry's profit motives and consumers' best interests. This realization led me to completely restructure my practice. I began charging fee-only fees rather than accepting any form of commission or product-based compensation. I developed specific protocols for identifying clients who might have been victimized by predatory sales practices. I created educational materials specifically designed to help seniors and their families recognize and avoid financial exploitation. Most importantly, I began working with other financial professionals to develop industry-wide standards for working with vulnerable populations. Too many advisors had been willing to look the other way when colleagues engaged in questionable practices, rationalizing that it wasn't their responsibility or that clients should be expected to protect themselves. The scale of the predatory annuity problem made it clear that this passive approach was no longer acceptable. The effort to develop professional standards faced significant resistance from industry organizations that worried about increased liability and regulatory scrutiny. Many advisors genuinely believed that their existing practices were adequate and saw calls for reform as unnecessary bureaucracy. Others were concerned that stricter standards would reduce their ability to earn commissions from product sales. But a growing coalition of fee-only advisors, consumer advocates, and ethical insurance professionals began pushing for meaningful change. We developed model practices for working with seniors, including requirements for family involvement in major financial decisions, mandatory waiting periods for large transactions, and standardized disclosures of fees and conflicts of interest. We also worked to educate consumers about their rights and the warning signs of predatory financial practices. This was challenging because many seniors had been conditioned to trust financial professionals and were reluctant to question recommendations from people who presented themselves as experts. The combination of generational deference to authority figures and the genuine complexity of modern financial products made seniors particularly vulnerable to manipulation. One of the most effective strategies we developed was family education programs that taught adult children and grandchildren how to recognize signs that their senior family members might be targeted by financial predators. These programs addressed the delicate balance between protecting seniors and respecting their autonomy, providing families with tools to have productive conversations about financial security without being overly paternalistic. The programs were revealing in what they uncovered about family dynamics and financial communication. Many families had never had honest conversations about money, retirement planning, or end-of-life care. Parents were often reluctant to burden their children with financial concerns, while children were hesitant to appear to be prying into their parents' affairs. This communication gap created opportunities for predatory salespeople to position themselves as trusted advisors filling an information void. Breaking down these communication barriers required addressing both practical and emotional obstacles. On the practical side, we developed tools and frameworks that made it easier for families to have productive financial conversations. We created checklists of important documents and account information, guides for evaluating financial advisors and products, and templates for family meetings about financial planning. The emotional obstacles were more challenging. Many seniors viewed their financial independence as fundamental to their dignity and self-worth. They worried that involving their children in financial decisions would be seen as evidence of declining capacity, or would burden their families with unwanted responsibilities. Children, meanwhile, often struggled with the role reversal of providing guidance to parents who had previously been their primary source of wisdom and support. Successfully addressing these concerns required acknowledging the legitimate fears and concerns on all sides while providing practical tools for maintaining appropriate boundaries and respect. We emphasized that financial transparency and family involvement were signs of strength and wisdom rather than weakness or dependence. We helped families develop communication strategies that honored seniors' autonomy while providing appropriate protection against exploitation. The educational efforts began to yield results, but progress was frustratingly slow. For every Eleanor who came forward to share her story and advocate for change, there were dozens of other seniors who remained silent about their experiences, either from embarrassment or because they didn't recognize that they had been victimized. The shame and stigma associated with financial exploitation often prevented victims from seeking help, allowing predatory practices to continue unchecked. This silence was particularly troubling because it enabled the financial services industry to minimize the scope of the problem and resist meaningful reforms. Industry representatives could point to the relatively small number of formal complaints and argue that predatory sales were isolated incidents rather than systematic practices. They could highlight satisfied customers and emphasize the benefits of their products while ignoring the broader patterns of abuse. Breaking through this silence required creating safe spaces for seniors to share their experiences and providing them with hope that their situations could be improved. This led to the development of support groups for financial exploitation victims, similar to those that had proven effective for other forms of elder abuse. These groups provided emotional support, practical guidance, and collective advocacy opportunities for seniors who had been victimized by predatory financial practices. The support groups were revelatory in what they uncovered about the psychological impact of financial exploitation. Many participants described feelings of shame, betrayal, and helplessness that extended far beyond the monetary losses they had suffered. They had trusted someone they believed was looking out for their best interests, and that trust had been systematically abused for profit. The betrayal was particularly acute because financial advisors and insurance agents often positioned themselves as surrogate family members, offering the guidance and support that seniors' actual relatives might not be providing. When that relationship was revealed to be based on manipulation and exploitation rather than genuine care, the emotional damage often exceeded the financial harm. Healing from this betrayal required more than just recovering lost money or exiting inappropriate products. It required rebuilding seniors' confidence in their own judgment and their ability to make sound financial decisions. It required helping them distinguish between legitimate financial advice and predatory sales tactics. Most importantly, it required providing them with tools and support systems that would prevent future victimization. The support groups became powerful advocates for policy change, as they provided lawmakers and regulators with compelling first-person testimony about the real-world impact of predatory financial practices. When Eleanor testified before the state legislature about her experience, her words carried far more weight than any academic study or industry analysis could provide. Her dignified description of how she had been manipulated and the ongoing impact on her financial security helped lawmakers understand the human cost of inadequate consumer protection. Similar testimony from support group members across the country contributed to a growing momentum for reform. While the insurance industry continued to resist significant changes to their business practices, the accumulating evidence of systematic abuse became increasingly difficult to ignore or dismiss. The regulatory response varied significantly by state, reflecting the fragmented nature of insurance oversight and the varying levels of political influence wielded by the insurance industry. Some states implemented meaningful reforms that strengthened suitability requirements, improved disclosure standards, and increased penalties for predatory sales practices. Others made only cosmetic changes that created an appearance of action without addressing the fundamental problems. At the federal level, progress was even more limited. While congressional hearings raised awareness of the issues, the insurance industry's political influence prevented significant regulatory changes. Industry representatives argued that state regulation was adequate and that federal intervention would create unnecessary bureaucracy and reduce consumer choice. They emphasized the voluntary nature of insurance purchases and argued that seniors were capable of making their own financial decisions without government interference. This argument was both philosophically appealing and practically misleading. While seniors certainly should have the right to make their own financial decisions, that right was meaningless if the decision-making process was corrupted by deliberate misinformation and emotional manipulation. True consumer choice required access to accurate information, honest advice, and reasonable time to consider alternatives, conditions that were systematically undermined by predatory sales practices. The industry's emphasis on voluntary purchases also ignored the power dynamics and information asymmetries that characterized the relationship between insurance agents and senior consumers. Agents were trained professionals with detailed knowledge of complex products, sophisticated sales techniques, and powerful psychological manipulation tools. Seniors, particularly those dealing with grief, health issues, or family stress, were often at a significant disadvantage in these interactions. Addressing these power imbalances required more than just better disclosure or stronger suitability requirements. It required fundamental changes to the incentive structures that rewarded agents for selling inappropriate products to vulnerable consumers. As long as agents earned significantly more money by selling high-cost, high-commission products than by recommending more suitable alternatives, the temptation to prioritize their own financial interests over their clients' welfare would remain strong. Some states began experimenting with fiduciary requirements that would legally obligate insurance agents to prioritize their clients' best interests over their own compensation. These requirements faced fierce industry resistance, as they threatened to significantly reduce agent compensation and limit the profitability of many insurance products. Industry representatives argued that fiduciary requirements would reduce seniors' access to insurance products and increase the cost of financial advice. The industry's opposition to fiduciary requirements revealed the fundamental tension between their business model and consumers' best interests. If putting clients' interests first would significantly reduce industry profitability, it suggested that much of the industry's current profitability came from practices that were not in clients' best interests. This was precisely the problem that reformers were trying to address. The debate over fiduciary requirements highlighted a broader question about the role of financial services in society. Should financial advisors and insurance agents be viewed primarily as salespeople whose job is to maximize their company's profits, or as professionals whose primary obligation is to serve their clients' best interests? The answer to this question would determine not just the future of insurance regulation, but the broader relationship between financial services providers and the consumers they claim to serve. For Eleanor and the thousands of other seniors who had been victimized by predatory insurance sales, this philosophical debate had immediate practical consequences. Every day that reform was delayed meant more seniors would fall victim to the same manipulative sales practices that had devastated their retirement security. Every regulatory loophole that remained open was an invitation for continued predatory behavior. The urgency of the problem was underscored by demographic trends that were increasing both the number of potential victims and the sophistication of predatory practices. The baby boomer generation was not only larger than previous cohorts of retirees, but also wealthier, making them particularly attractive targets for financial predators. At the same time, advances in data analytics and behavioral psychology were giving predatory salespeople increasingly powerful tools for identifying and manipulating vulnerable consumers. Insurance companies were using credit reports, public records, and online behavior to create detailed profiles of potential customers, identifying those most likely to be vulnerable to specific sales pitches. They were employing behavioral economists and psychologists to refine their marketing messages and sales techniques. They were using artificial intelligence to optimize the timing and content of their outreach efforts to maximize their effectiveness. These technological advances were being deployed in service of the same predatory practices that had victimized Eleanor, but with unprecedented precision and scale. The combination of big data analytics and psychological manipulation created the potential for financial exploitation on a scale that would have been unimaginable just a few years earlier. The response from consumer protection advocates was hampered by resource constraints and the rapidly evolving nature of the threat. Regulatory agencies struggled to keep pace with new products and sales techniques, often responding to problems only after they had already affected thousands of consumers. Consumer advocacy groups lacked the technical expertise and financial resources to match the insurance industry's sophisticated marketing and lobbying efforts. Individual financial advisors like myself could help clients who had already been victimized, but we lacked the tools and authority to prevent the systematic predatory practices that were creating new victims every day. The scale of the problem required coordinated action at the industry and regulatory level, but such coordination was difficult to achieve given the fragmented nature of financial services regulation and the industry's political influence. The frustration of working within this system led me to become increasingly vocal about the need for fundamental reform. I began writing articles for industry publications, speaking at conferences, and working with journalists to expose predatory practices and advocate for stronger consumer protections. This advocacy work was both rewarding and exhausting, as it required constantly documenting new forms of abuse while fighting an industry with virtually unlimited resources and political influence. The personal cost of this advocacy became clear when I started receiving threatening phone calls and legal threats from insurance companies whose practices I had criticized. Industry representatives attempted to discredit my research, questioning my motives, and suggesting that I was simply trying to eliminate competition for my own advisory services. They pointed out that I charged fees for financial planning services and argued that I had a financial incentive to criticize commission-based products. This criticism stung because it contained a grain of truth. I did benefit financially when clients chose to work with me rather than purchasing insurance products from commissioned agents. However, the fundamental difference was that my fees were transparent and aligned with my clients' interests, while the insurance industry's commission structure created systematic incentives to recommend inappropriate products to vulnerable consumers. The industry's attempts at discreditation also revealed their desperation to prevent meaningful scrutiny of their practices. Rather than addressing the substantive concerns I had raised about predatory sales techniques and inappropriate products, they chose to attack my credibility and motives. This ad hominem approach suggested that they were unable or unwilling to defend their practices on their merits. The pressure intensified when National Prosperity Insurance filed a defamation lawsuit against me, claiming that my public statements about their sales practices had damaged their reputation and cost them business. The lawsuit was clearly intended to silence my criticism rather than to address the underlying issues, as it focused on technical aspects of my public statements rather than their accuracy or the harm caused by the company's practices. Fighting the lawsuit required hiring expensive attorneys and spending countless hours preparing depositions and document productions. The legal process was designed to be intimidating and costly, and I understood why most critics of the insurance industry chose to remain silent rather than face this kind of retaliation. The lawsuit was eventually dismissed, but not before consuming months of my time and tens of thousands of dollars in legal fees. The experience reinforced my understanding of how the financial services industry maintained its ability to engage in predatory practices. By making criticism expensive and risky, they discouraged the kind of scrutiny and accountability that might lead to meaningful reform. Victims like Eleanor were reluctant to speak out because they feared retaliation or additional financial losses. Industry professionals who witnessed problematic practices remained silent to protect their careers and avoid legal threats. This culture of silence enabled predatory behavior to continue and evolve, as companies could experiment with new forms of manipulation and exploitation without fear of exposure or consequences. The occasional regulatory action or media investigation was viewed as a cost of doing business rather than a deterrent to future misconduct. Breaking through this culture required creating support systems that protected critics and victims from retaliation while amplifying their voices sufficiently to overcome the industry's messaging machine. This led to the formation of the Coalition for Senior Financial Protection, a joint effort between consumer advocates, ethical financial professionals, and academic researchers focused on combating predatory financial practices targeting seniors. The coalition provided legal support for victims and critics facing retaliation, conducted research on the scope and impact of predatory practices, and coordinated advocacy efforts across multiple states and regulatory jurisdictions. Most importantly, it created a platform for victims like Eleanor to share their stories and advocate for change without facing individual retaliation. Eleanor became one of the coalition's most effective spokespeople, traveling to conferences and legislative hearings across the country to share her experience and advocate for stronger consumer protections. Her dignified presentation and obvious intelligence made it difficult for industry representatives to dismiss her as confused or unsophisticated. When she described how Derek Morrison had exploited her grief and manipulated her fears, lawmakers and regulators could see clearly how predatory sales techniques operated in practice. The insurance industry wants you to believe that people like me are just unlucky or unsophisticated, Eleanor told a congressional committee examining elder financial abuse. But I want you to understand that what happened to me was not an accident. It was the result of a deliberate strategy to identify vulnerable seniors and exploit our fears and confusion for profit. These companies spend millions of dollars researching how to manipulate people like me, and then they act surprised when their techniques work. Eleanor's testimony was particularly powerful because she had done her homework, researching National Prosperity Insurance's marketing materials, sales training programs, and financial performance. She could speak knowledgeably about commission structures, surrender charges, and fee calculations. She had transformed herself from victim to expert, and her expertise made her advocacy far more effective than emotional appeals alone could have achieved. The coalition's research efforts were equally important in building the case for reform. Working with academic partners, we conducted the first comprehensive study of predatory annuity sales, surveying thousands of seniors about their experiences with insurance purchases and analyzing complaint data from state insurance departments across the country. The results were even more disturbing than we had anticipated. Our survey found that nearly 40% of seniors who had purchased hybrid annuity long-term care products had been contacted by agents within 6 months of a major life event, such as the death of a spouse, a health crisis, or a divorce. More than 60% reported feeling pressured to make immediate decisions without adequate time to consult with family members or other advisors. Most troubling, our analysis of complaint data revealed that the vast majority of problematic sales went unreported. For every formal complaint filed with state insurance departments, our survey suggested there were dozens of similar cases where seniors either didn't recognize they had been victimized or were too embarrassed or intimidated to file complaints. This research provided the empirical foundation needed to support policy reforms and counter the insurance industry's arguments that predatory sales were isolated incidents. The scale and systematic nature of the problem became undeniable when confronted with comprehensive data rather than anecdotal reports. Armed with this research and Eleanor's compelling testimony, the coalition began achieving meaningful policy victories. Several states strengthened their suitability requirements for annuity sales, requiring agents to document why specific products were appropriate for individual clients. Others implemented cooling-off periods that gave seniors time to reconsider major financial decisions without penalty. Perhaps most significantly, 3 states passed legislation requiring fiduciary standards for all financial professionals working with seniors, regardless of whether they were technically acting as advisors or salespeople. These laws recognized that seniors often couldn't distinguish between different types of financial professionals and deserved the same level of protection regardless of the technical classification of the person they were working with. The industry fought these reforms vigorously, arguing that they would reduce seniors' access to important financial products and increase the cost of financial advice. They funded studies purporting to show that fiduciary requirements would force agents to abandon senior clients who couldn't afford to pay advisory fees. They lobbied extensively against proposed regulations and threatened to pull their business from states that implemented strong consumer protection measures. Despite this opposition, the momentum for reform continued to build. Media coverage of predatory insurance sales had made the issue a political priority in many states, and lawmakers were reluctant to appear to be protecting financial predators at the expense of vulnerable seniors. Consumer advocacy groups mobilized their members to support reform legislation, and the coalition provided expert testimony and research to support policy proposals. The breakthrough came when the attorneys general of 12 states announced a coordinated investigation into the marketing and sales practices of major insurance companies selling hybrid annuity long-term care products. The investigation was triggered by the coalition's research and the accumulating evidence of systematic predatory behavior, but it gained momentum when several insurance company whistleblowers came forward with internal documents revealing the deliberate nature of these practices. The most damaging revelations came from a former National Prosperity Insurance executive who provided documents showing that the company had specifically developed products designed to maximize profits from cognitively impaired and emotionally vulnerable seniors. The documents included detailed profiles of ideal target customers, scripts for overcoming common objections, and performance metrics that rewarded agents for selling products with the highest profit margins rather than those most suitable for clients. One particularly damning document was a training manual titled Monetizing Mortality: Advanced Techniques for Grief-Based Sales. The manual provided step-by-step instructions for identifying recently widowed seniors, exploiting their emotional vulnerability, and overcoming family members' objections to inappropriate product purchases. It included psychological profiles of different types of grieving clients and recommended manipulation techniques tailored to each personality type. The manual's casual discussion of psychological manipulation was breathtaking in its cynicism. It described grief as a profit opportunity and provided detailed instructions on how to exploit seniors' fears about becoming financial burdens on their children. It recommended using phrases like, "This is what your spouse would have wanted," and "You need to protect yourself the way they protected you," to overcome resistance to high-cost products. When these documents were made public as part of the Attorney's General investigation, they created a firestorm of controversy that finally brought national attention to the systematic nature of predatory insurance sales. The documents proved that these weren't isolated cases of overzealous agents, but rather the predictable result of corporate strategies designed to exploit vulnerable seniors for profit. The public reaction was swift and decisive. National Prosperity Insurance's stock price plummeted as investors realized the company faced potentially massive legal liability for its predatory practices. Other insurance companies rushed to distance themselves from similar tactics, announcing voluntary reforms to their sales practices and marketing strategies. Industry trade associations scrambled to develop new ethical guidelines for selling insurance products to seniors. Most importantly, the scandal galvanized political support for comprehensive reform. Lawmakers who had previously been reluctant to challenge the insurance industry's political influence found themselves under intense pressure to protect vulnerable seniors from financial exploitation. The combination of compelling victim testimony, comprehensive research data, and smoking gun internal documents created an irresistible case for meaningful reform. The regulatory response was more comprehensive than any previous effort to address predatory financial practices targeting seniors. The Attorney's General investigation resulted in a $2.4 billion settlement that required National Prosperity Insurance and several other companies to change their sales practices, provide restitution to victims, and submit to ongoing oversight of their marketing and sales activities. The settlement included specific requirements that addressed many of the predatory practices the coalition had identified. Companies were prohibited from marketing to seniors within 12 months of major life events, such as the death of a spouse, unless the senior had specifically requested contact. Agents were required to provide clear, standardized disclosures of all fees and surrender charges before any sales presentation. Seniors were given a mandatory 7-day cooling-off period during which they could cancel any insurance purchase without penalty. Perhaps most significantly, the settlement required participating companies to implement fiduciary standards for all interactions with seniors, regardless of the technical nature of the relationship. This meant that agents would be legally required to prioritize seniors' best interests over their own compensation, a fundamental shift from the industry's traditional sales-focused approach. The settlement also established a victim compensation fund that provided financial relief to seniors who had been harmed by predatory sales practices. Eleanor was among the first beneficiaries, receiving not only a full refund of her original investment, but also compensation for the opportunity costs and emotional distress she had suffered. While money could never fully repair the damage that had been done, the compensation provided Eleanor with financial security and a sense that justice had been served. For Eleanor, the settlement represented vindication of her decision to speak out about her experience, despite the personal cost and potential retaliation. Her courage in sharing her story had been instrumental in building the case for reform and had helped protect countless other seniors from similar exploitation. The fact that her advocacy had led to meaningful systemic change gave her a sense of purpose and accomplishment that helped heal some of the emotional wounds inflicted by Derek Morrison's manipulation. The settlement and accompanying reforms represented a significant victory for seniors' rights and consumer protection, but they also highlighted the limitations of the existing regulatory system. The most meaningful changes had come only after years of advocacy, extensive media coverage, and overwhelming evidence of systematic abuse. The insurance industry had been allowed to continue predatory practices for years, while regulators and policymakers struggled to understand and address the problem. Moreover, the reforms primarily addressed the most egregious forms of predatory behavior, while leaving many of the underlying structural problems intact. Insurance companies could still market complex, high-fee products to seniors, as long as they avoided the most obviously manipulative sales tactics. The fundamental misalignment between industry profit motives and consumer welfare remained largely unchanged. The experience also revealed the critical importance of victim advocacy in achieving meaningful reform. Eleanor's willingness to share her story publicly had been essential to building political support for change, but it had required tremendous personal courage and resilience. Most victims of financial exploitation never found the strength or support needed to become advocates, leaving countless cases of abuse hidden and unaddressed. This recognition led to expanded efforts to identify and support victims of financial exploitation. The coalition worked with senior centers, healthcare providers, and social service organizations to develop screening tools that could help identify seniors who might have been victimized by predatory sales practices. We created support groups and counseling services specifically designed to help seniors process the emotional trauma of financial exploitation while taking practical steps to address their situations. We also developed educational programs aimed at preventing future victimization. These programs went beyond simple warnings about specific scams to provide seniors with tools for evaluating financial advice, recognizing manipulation techniques, and making informed decisions about complex financial products. The programs emphasize the importance of seeking second opinions, involving family members in major financial decisions, and taking time to carefully review any significant financial commitment. The educational efforts faced the ongoing challenge of reaching seniors who were most vulnerable to exploitation. Those who attended financial literacy workshops and support groups were often already relatively sophisticated about financial matters and skeptical of high-pressure sales tactics. The seniors most likely to fall victim to predatory practices were often isolated, grieving, or dealing with health issues that made them less likely to seek out educational resources. This challenge led to innovative outreach strategies that brought education directly to vulnerable seniors, rather than expecting them to seek it out. We partnered with healthcare providers to include financial exploitation prevention in routine medical consultations for seniors. We worked with faith-based organizations to incorporate financial literacy into their senior ministry programs. We developed materials specifically designed for family members and caregivers who might be in a position to identify and address potential exploitation. The healthcare partnership was particularly effective because it recognized the strong correlation between health issues and financial vulnerability among seniors. Seniors dealing with serious medical conditions were often prime targets for predatory salespeople who exploited their fears about medical expenses and long-term care costs. By integrating financial exploitation prevention into healthcare settings, we could reach seniors at precisely the moment when they were most vulnerable to manipulation. The faith-based partnerships were equally important because many seniors trusted religious institutions more than government agencies or financial service providers. Religious leaders could deliver warnings about financial exploitation in a context that seniors found credible and non-threatening. They could also provide ongoing support and accountability for seniors making major financial decisions. These prevention efforts began to show measurable results within 2 years of their implementation. Complaint data from participating states showed significant reductions in reports of inappropriate annuity sales to seniors. Surveys of program participants showed increased knowledge of warning signs and greater confidence in evaluating financial advice. Most encouragingly, several seniors reported that the education they had received had helped them avoid potentially devastating financial decisions. However, the success of these prevention efforts also revealed the ongoing evolution of predatory practices. As traditional high-pressure sales tactics became less effective due to increased awareness and regulatory scrutiny, financial predators began developing more sophisticated approaches that were harder to detect and counter. Some companies shifted their focus from individual sales to marketing through trusted intermediaries such as tax preparers, estate planning attorneys, and even other financial advisors. By recruiting these intermediaries as sales channels, predatory companies could leverage existing trust relationships while insulating themselves from direct regulatory oversight of their sales practices. Others began using advanced data analytics and behavioral targeting to identify and approach vulnerable seniors with unprecedented precision. Instead of cold calling from obituary lists, they could use credit reports, public records, and online behavior to create detailed profiles of seniors' financial situations and psychological vulnerabilities. This allowed them to craft highly targeted sales pitches that appeared to address each individual's specific concerns and circumstances. Perhaps most troubling, some companies began developing products that were technically compliant with new regulatory requirements, while still achieving the same predatory objectives through different means. They created annuities with lower surrender charges but higher ongoing fees, or products with better liquidity features but more restrictive benefit provisions. The complexity of these products made it difficult for seniors and even professional advisors to understand their true costs and risks. This ongoing evolution of predatory practices highlighted the fundamental challenge of protecting vulnerable consumers from sophisticated financial predators. No single reform or educational program could provide complete protection against an industry that was constantly innovating new ways to exploit consumer confusion and vulnerability. Effective consumer protection required ongoing vigilance, continuous adaptation of regulatory frameworks, and sustained advocacy efforts. The recognition of this challenge led to the development of more comprehensive and adaptive approaches to consumer protection. Rather than focusing solely on specific products or sales practices, reformers began working to address the underlying structural factors that enabled financial exploitation of seniors. One key element was the development of professional standards that applied broadly to all financial services interactions with seniors, regardless of the specific products involved or the technical classification of the service provider. These standards recognized that seniors often couldn't distinguish between different types of financial professionals and deserved consistent protection regardless of whom they were working with. Another important element was the creation of ongoing monitoring and enforcement mechanisms that could identify and respond to new forms of predatory behavior as they emerged. Traditional regulatory approaches that relied on complaint-driven enforcement were inadequate for addressing sophisticated predators who specifically targeted victims who were unlikely or unable to file complaints. The most promising development was the emergence of technology-based solutions that could help level the playing field between sophisticated predators and vulnerable consumers. These included apps and online tools that could help seniors evaluate financial products, identify potential red flags in sales presentations, and connect with qualified advisors who were held to fiduciary standards. For example, the coalition partnered with technology developers to create a smartphone app called Senior Shield that could analyze insurance and annuity proposals, flagging potentially problematic features such as high fees, restrictive surrender charges, or complex benefit provisions. The app also provided access to educational resources, second opinion services, and a database of advisors who had committed to fiduciary standards when working with seniors. While technology couldn't replace human judgment and personal relationships, It could provide seniors with tools and information that had previously been available only to industry professionals. This democratization of financial expertise had the potential to significantly reduce the information asymmetries that predatory salespeople had traditionally exploited. The app was initially met with skepticism from both seniors and industry professionals. Many seniors were uncomfortable with technology and preferred to rely on personal relationships and traditional sources of advice. Industry professionals worried that the app would undermine their expertise and reduce their ability to serve clients effectively. However, early adoption results were encouraging. Seniors who used the app reported feeling more confident in their financial decisions and less susceptible to high-pressure sales tactics. Several users reported that the app had helped them identify problematic features in products they were considering, leading them to seek alternatives that better met their needs. Perhaps most importantly, the app began to change the dynamics of the sales process itself. Agents who knew that their prospects might use technology to verify their claims and analyze their proposals had strong incentives to be more honest and thorough in their presentations. This created a positive feedback loop that improved the quality of financial advice even for seniors who didn't use the technology directly. The success of these technological solutions led to expanded efforts to develop and deploy consumer protection tools. We partnered with state insurance departments to create online databases of agent disciplinary actions and consumer complaints, making it easier for seniors to research potential advisors before working with them. We developed automated monitoring systems that could identify suspicious patterns in insurance sales data, helping regulators detect and investigate potential predatory practices more quickly. We also worked with financial institutions to implement protective measures that could identify and prevent potentially problematic transactions. Banks and investment companies began using transaction monitoring systems to flag large or unusual transfers to insurance companies, particularly when they involved recently widowed account holders or accounts that had previously shown little activity. These protective measures faced significant resistance from the financial services industry, which argued that they would create unnecessary friction in legitimate transactions and potentially discriminate against seniors by treating them differently from other customers. Industry representatives claimed that such measures would patronize seniors and undermine their financial independence. This argument reflected the industry's continued unwillingness to acknowledge the systematic nature of senior financial exploitation and the power imbalances that made protective measures necessary. While seniors certainly deserved to maintain their financial independence, that independence was meaningless if it could be easily undermined by sophisticated manipulation and deception. The tension between protection and autonomy remained one of the most challenging aspects of combating senior financial exploitation. Any protective measure that was strong enough to effectively prevent predatory behavior risked being seen as paternalistic or discriminatory. Conversely, measures that fully respected seniors' autonomy might be too weak to prevent sophisticated predators from exploiting vulnerable individuals. Finding the right balance required ongoing dialogue between seniors, their advocates, industry professionals, and policymakers. Eleanor played a crucial role in these discussions, helping to articulate the senior perspective and ensure that protective measures were developed with appropriate input from the people they were designed to help. "I don't want to be treated like a child," Eleanor told a conference on senior financial protection. "But I also don't want other people to go through what I went through. If a few extra questions or a waiting period can prevent someone from being manipulated the way I was, then that's a reasonable price to pay for protection. The key is making sure these measures actually protect people, rather than just making it harder for everyone to get financial help." Eleanor's perspective helped shape the development of protective measures that focused on enhancing seniors' ability to make informed decisions, rather than limiting their choices. Instead of prohibiting certain types of transactions, the emphasis was on ensuring that seniors had access to accurate information, adequate time to consider their options, and appropriate support from trusted advisors or family members. This approach proved more effective and politically sustainable than more restrictive alternatives. Seniors were generally supportive of measures that helped them make better decisions, while industry professionals found it harder to argue against requirements for transparency and informed consent than against outright prohibitions. The success of this balanced approach led to its adoption in multiple states and served as a model for federal policy discussions. While comprehensive federal reform remained elusive due to the insurance industry's continued political influence, the growing consensus around protection through empowerment approaches provided a foundation for future progress. 5 years after Eleanor first walked into my office with tears in her eyes, the landscape of senior financial protection had been fundamentally transformed. What had started as one woman's personal tragedy had sparked a nationwide movement that changed laws, industry practices, and public awareness of financial exploitation targeting seniors. The quantitative measures of success were impressive. Complaints about inappropriate annuity. Sales to seniors had decreased by more than 60% in states that had implemented comprehensive reforms. Industry surveys showed significant improvements in sales practices and agent training. Consumer awareness of financial exploitation red flags had increased dramatically, as measured by both formal surveys and informal indicators such as social media discussions and educational program attendance. But the most meaningful measure of success was the number of seniors who had been protected from the kind of exploitation that Eleanor had experienced. While it was impossible to count the financial devastation that had been prevented, the stories of seniors who had avoided predatory sales because of increased awareness, improved regulation, or better protective measures provided powerful evidence of the reform movement's impact. Eleanor herself had become a nationally recognized advocate for senior financial protection, speaking at conferences, testifying before legislative bodies, and providing guidance to other victims of financial exploitation. Her transformation from victim to advocate had not only helped countless other seniors, but had also provided her with a sense of purpose and empowerment that helped heal the emotional wounds inflicted by Derek Morrison's manipulation. "What happened to me was terrible," Eleanor reflected during a recent interview about her advocacy work. "But if my experience has helped protect other people from going through the same thing, then something good has come from it. I can't get back the money I lost or the peace of mind that was taken from me, but I can help make sure that other people don't have to go through what I went through." The insurance industry, meanwhile, had been forced to confront the systematic predatory practices that had generated billions in profits at seniors' expense. While many companies continued to resist meaningful reform, others had embraced higher ethical standards and developed new business models that aligned their interests with those of their customers. National Prosperity Insurance itself had been fundamentally transformed by the scandal and subsequent settlement. The company had replaced its senior management, implemented comprehensive reforms to its sales and marketing practices, and shifted its focus from high-commission products to more suitable insurance solutions for seniors. While skeptics questioned whether these changes represented genuine reform or merely a public relations response to regulatory pressure, early indicators suggested that the company's new approach was both more ethical and ultimately more sustainable. The broader transformation of the insurance industry remained incomplete, however. Many of the structural factors that had enabled predatory practices in the first place continued to exist, including misaligned incentive structures, complex products that obscured their true costs and risks, and regulatory frameworks that struggled to keep pace with industry innovation. Moreover, the success of reforms targeting insurance products had led some financial predators to shift their focus to other areas where oversight was less developed and public awareness was lower. Reports began emerging of similar predatory practices involving reverse mortgages, investment products marketed as safe alternatives to bank deposits, and even cryptocurrency schemes targeting seniors. This ongoing evolution of predatory practices underscored the need for continued vigilance and adaptation in consumer protection efforts. The victory against predatory annuity sales was significant and meaningful, but it was not a permanent solution to the broader problem of financial exploitation targeting vulnerable populations. The experience had also highlighted the critical importance of victim advocacy in achieving meaningful reform. Eleanor's courage in speaking out about her experience had been essential to building public and political support for change. Her willingness to transform her personal tragedy into a force for systemic reform had made the difference between isolated regulatory actions and comprehensive policy change. This lesson had implications that extended far beyond financial services. In any situation where powerful institutions systematically exploit vulnerable populations, meaningful reform requires not just policy expertise or regulatory authority, but also the compelling human stories that help the public and policymakers understand what's at stake. The challenge was creating support systems that enabled more victims to find their voice and become advocates for change. Eleanor had been fortunate to have family support, financial resources that allowed her to take time for advocacy work, and personal characteristics that made her an effective spokesperson. Many other victims of financial exploitation lacked these advantages and needed additional support to participate in reform efforts. The Coalition's Victim Advocacy Program had made important progress in providing this support, but much more was needed. Creating pathways for victim participation in reform efforts required addressing not just the practical barriers to advocacy, but also the emotional and psychological obstacles that prevented many victims from speaking out about their experiences. The shame and stigma associated with financial exploitation remain significant barriers to victim advocacy. Many seniors blamed themselves for being foolish or gullible, rather than recognizing that they had been systematically victimized by sophisticated predators. This self-blame was often reinforced by family members, friends, and even professionals who questioned how smart people could fall for obvious scams. Overcoming the stigma required changing public understanding of financial exploitation from individual failures to systematic predatory behavior. Eleanor's advocacy had been instrumental in this shift, as her obvious intelligence and dignity made it difficult for anyone to dismiss her experience as the result of personal shortcomings. People need to understand that being victimized by financial predators doesn't mean you're stupid or weak, Eleanor explained to a support group for exploitation victims. These companies spend millions of dollars researching how to manipulate people, and they specifically target us when we're most vulnerable. Falling for their techniques doesn't say anything about your intelligence or character. It says something about their sophistication and ruthlessness. This message resonated powerfully with other victims and helped many of them move beyond shame and self-blame toward advocacy and action. The support groups Eleanor helped facilitate became incubators for new advocates, as victims found strength in shared experiences and collective action. The broader impact of the senior financial protection movement extended beyond its immediate policy achievements to influence public discourse about vulnerability, protection, and empowerment in an aging society. The movement had demonstrated that seniors could be both vulnerable to exploitation and powerful advocates for change, challenging stereotypes that portrayed older Americans as either completely independent or completely dependent. This nuanced understanding of senior vulnerability and agency had implications for policy discussions ranging from healthcare and housing to technology and transportation. Instead of viewing seniors as either fully autonomous individuals who needed no special protections or as helpless victims who required paternalistic oversight, policymakers began developing more sophisticated approaches that enhanced seniors' ability to make informed decisions while providing appropriate safeguards against exploitation. The movement had also contributed to a broader rethinking of the relationship between financial services and consumer protection. The traditional regulatory approach that relied primarily on disclosure and market discipline had proven inadequate for protecting vulnerable consumers from sophisticated predators. New approaches that emphasized fiduciary obligations, structural reforms, and proactive protection measures were gaining acceptance across multiple areas of financial regulation. Perhaps most importantly, the movement had demonstrated that meaningful reform was possible even when confronting powerful industries with strong political influence and vast financial resources. The combination of compelling victim testimony, rigorous research, strategic advocacy, and sustained political pressure had overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles to achieve significant policy change. This lesson provided hope and inspiration for advocates working on other issues where vulnerable populations face systematic exploitation by powerful interests. The senior financial protection movement had created a template for effective advocacy, that could be adapted and applied to other challenges facing vulnerable communities. As I reflected on the journey from Eleanor's tearful visit to my office to the comprehensive reforms that had followed, I was struck by the profound impact that one person's courage could have when combined with systematic advocacy and sustained effort. Eleanor's decision to speak out about her experience had not only helped her find healing and purpose, but had also protected countless other seniors from similar exploitation. The work was far from complete, however. New forms of predatory behavior continued to emerge, and the fundamental challenges of protecting vulnerable consumers in complex markets remained daunting. The success of the senior financial protection movement had created momentum for continued progress, but translating that momentum into lasting change would require ongoing vigilance and commitment from advocates, policymakers, and the broader public. For Eleanor, now 87, and still actively involved in advocacy work, the long-term impact of her experience was still unfolding. The financial losses she had suffered could never be fully recovered, and the emotional trauma of being systematically deceived and manipulated would always be part of her story. But her transformation from victim to advocate had given her life new meaning and had helped countless other seniors avoid similar tragedies. "I never wanted to become a public speaker or an advocate," Eleanor reflected during our most recent conversation. "I just wanted to retire quietly and enjoy my remaining years with my family. But sometimes life forces you to become something you never expected to be. If I had to go through this experience to help protect other people, then I'm glad I was strong enough to handle it and smart enough to speak out." Eleanor's story, and the broader movement it had inspired, demonstrated the power of individual courage combined with collective action to achieve meaningful social change. In a world where vulnerable populations often face exploitation by powerful interests, their example provided both inspiration and a practical roadmap for effective advocacy. The battle to protect seniors from financial exploitation was ongoing, but Eleanor Whitman had shown that it was a battle worth fighting, and one that could be won. Her legacy would be measured not just in the reforms that had been achieved, but in the lives that had been protected, and the hope that had been kindled for a more just and equitable financial system. As retirement planners, we have a professional and moral obligation to be vigilant about these predatory practices and to protect our clients from financial exploitation. The story of Eleanor Whitman and the thousands of other seniors who have fallen victim to predatory insurance sales serves as a powerful reminder that our industry's most vulnerable clients deserve our strongest protection, not our most aggressive sales tactics. The reforms that have been achieved provide hope for a better future, but they also highlight the ongoing need for vigilance, advocacy, and commitment to putting clients' interests first. Every senior who sits in our offices deserves the same protection and respect we would want for our own parents and grandparents. Their trust in us is sacred, and we must never allow it to be betrayed for profit. The insurance plan that shocked me as a retirement planner was not just one product or one company's predatory practices. It was an entire industry's systematic exploitation of our most vulnerable citizens. Understanding how these schemes operate and protecting our clients from them is not just good business. It's our moral duty as professionals entrusted with people's financial futures and their dreams of a secure retirement.